The night the blizzard swallowed Millhaven whole, Deputy Elias Marsh stopped walking and looked up at a hillside that had no reason to be warm. He had been moving through the dark for 2 hours, leading 27 people through snow that came to his knees in the shallow places and his waist in the drifts. The temperature was 35 degrees below zero, and still falling, the kind of cold that did not feel like cold anymore, but like pressure, like the air itself was squeezing the life out of everything it touched. 3 of the children had stopped crying a mile back, and that silence worried him more than the crying had. He almost missed it. A thread of smoke, pale against the sky, the color of iron, rising from a rock formation on the south-facing slope. Not a campfire, not a chimney in any shape he recognized. A steel pipe painted the same gray-brown as the surrounding limestone, angled just enough to draw without betraying itself to anyone who did not already know where to look. Marsh stood at the base of that hillside and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, something older than hope. The recognition that someone somewhere had thought further ahead than the rest of them. He turned to the people behind him. 27 faces, frost-white and hollow, breathing in desperate clouds that vanished instantly in the killing air. He pointed up the slope. Nobody spoke. They started climbing. The door was steel set flush into the hillside and framed with limestone blocks so precisely fitted that the seams were nearly invisible. Marsh raised his fist and knocked 3 times. The sound rang out flat and hard in the frozen air and then disappeared into the wind. Inside, Charlotte Wren heard it. She was in the back of the shelter, rotating canned goods by date the way she did every evening, moving the oldest tins to the front of the shelves with the methodical patience of someone who had built this habit long before she built this room. When the knock came, she set down a jar of green beans and went still. She had known this moment might come. She had prepared for it in the abstract way that a person prepares for things they hope will never be necessary. But knowing something and standing inside it were entirely different experiences, and Charlotte Wren stood motionless in the lamplight for a long moment, her right hand resting on the edge of a shelf, her left hand already moving without her permission toward the door. She walked to the steel door and pressed her ear against the cold metal. "Who is it?" "Deputy Marsh. I have people with me, Charlotte. We need help." She closed her eyes. The math arrived without being invited. 1 person, 4 months of supplies. 2 people, 2 months. 28 people changed every number in every calculation she had ever made. "How many?" "28 counting me. Families, children. We have been walking for 2 hours. Some of them will not make it much longer." She stood there with her hand on the bolt and her eyes still closed. She was not deciding whether to open the door. She had already decided that the moment she heard his voice, what she was doing in those few seconds of stillness was saying goodbye to the version of this shelter that had existed until now, the version that belonged only to her. Then she slid the bolt and opened the door, and the cold hit her like a fist. Beyond Marsh's frost-covered coat, she saw them. Owen Pruitt from the supply store, lips nearly blue. Harriet Dunn from the boarding house, weeping and shaking. Mabel Forsythe, wife of the largest landowner in the county, rigid with cold and something that might have been shame. Reverend Caleb Morrow, eyes closed, mouth moving in silent prayer. Amy, her younger sister, holding her 6-year-old son James against her chest with both arms, the boy's face the color of tallow. And at the back of the group, too large for the doorframe and too proud to acknowledge it, Frank Aldridge, the blacksmith, ducking his head to enter without meeting her eyes. "Inside," Charlotte said, "now." They moved like people who had stopped trusting their own legs, stumbling through the entrance into warmth that seemed impossible after days of cold that burned. The shelter that Charlotte had built for solitude filled in minutes with bodies and breath and the smell of wet wool and terror. She sealed the door behind the last person and turned to face the room. "Listen carefully," she said. "This space has limits. We follow rules or we do not survive. Is that understood?" 27 heads nodded. Not one voice rose in argument. She went to work. But to understand what Charlotte Wren built and why, and what it cost her to build it, you have to go back 8 months to a Tuesday morning in May of 1887, when she walked into Owen Pruitt's supply store and changed the shape of her own life in the time it took to unfold a piece of paper. Millhaven, Kansas sat on the open plains 30 miles east of the new Union Pacific line, small enough that everyone knew your name and large enough that everyone had an opinion about what that name meant. 300 souls, a church, a boarding house, a blacksmith, a supply store, a banker, and the particular kind of social order that forms in isolated places where people have nothing to do in winter but talk about each other. The spring of 1887 was beautiful in the way that the plains could be beautiful, which was to say, completely and without apology. The wheat was coming in strong. The sky ran unbroken from horizon to horizon. People in Millhaven looked at that sky and felt the particular confidence of those who had survived hard years and were enjoying an easy one. Charlotte did not feel it. She had lived in Millhaven her entire life, married at 22 to Gerald Wren, a man whose charm had been genuine enough in the beginning and whose failings had revealed themselves slowly, the way floodwater rises almost imperceptibly until it is already over the threshold. Gerald left in the fall of 1886, slipping away to Denver with a woman 15 years younger and cleaning out their joint account on his way out the door. The legal situation was complicated. In Kansas in 1887, a woman whose husband had abandoned her existed in a peculiar social limbo, neither widow nor wife, carrying the implication that something about her had driven him away. The town offered sympathy in public and judgment in private, the way small towns always do. Douglas Holt, who ran the only bank in Millhaven, and who had always seemed to Charlotte like a man whose friendliness was a kind of arithmetic, found a clause in the mortgage agreement 3 months after Gerald left, Clause 3A, which concerned joint liability and the conditions under which a sole remaining borrower could be required to liquidate collateral to satisfy the outstanding debt. He presented it to Charlotte over his desk in a voice of practiced regret, his hands folded his eyes, carrying that particular sympathy of men who have already decided what they are going to do. She lost 40 acres of prime wheat land. She kept the house and the 10 acres of rocky hillside to the south that no one had ever wanted because it was too uneven to plow. She had stood in that bank office and looked at Douglas Holt across his mahogany desk and felt something settle in her chest. Not anger exactly, something harder and quieter than anger. A decision made without words that she would never again be in a position where someone else held the tools she needed to survive. She spent the winter reading. Her father, William Wren, had been a mining engineer in Pennsylvania before he came west, and he had left behind a trunk of technical books and a green-covered notebook filled with his own observations about soil composition, structural loads, and the properties of various building materials. Charlotte had looked at that notebook 100 times over the years, the way you look at something that belongs to the past. That winter, she read it the way you read something that belongs to the future. By April, she had filled 12 pages of her own notes. By the first week of May, she had a design. She walked into Owen Pruitt's store on a Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, the hour she was certain he would have no other customers. Owen was a man of 55 with a practical mind and the merchant's habit of forming quick opinions about what a given customer actually needed versus what they said they needed. He looked up from his invoice pad when Charlotte came in. She placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. Owen opened it. It was a materials list written in a precise, slightly small hand. Portland cement limestone blocks, steel pipe in 3 diameters, enough rebar to frame a foundation in a particular item at the bottom that made him read it twice. One heavy steel door, salvaged from the Dodge City Bank renovation, which he had seen advertised in the county trade circular 2 weeks earlier. He looked up at her. "What are you building?" "A shelter, into the south hillside behind my property." Owen looked out the front window at the May sunshine lying golden and uncomplicated across the plains in every direction. "Shelter from what?" Charlotte folded the paper and put it back in her coat pocket. "From whatever requires one." She turned and walked out before he could form his next question. By noon that day, the story had reached Harriet Dunn's boarding house, which was where all stories in Millhaven went to be processed, embellished, and redistributed. Harriet ran the best coffee in town and the only place that received the Kansas City newspapers reliably, which meant that the boarding house was where people gathered not just to sleep, but to understand what was happening. By the time Charlotte's order had been discussed across 3 tables at the midday meal, it had acquired a tone. Not malicious exactly, more like the particular amusement of a community that has identified something it considers eccentric. By Friday, it had a name: Charlotte's Folly. Mabel Forsythe heard the story at the boarding house on Wednesday and said nothing. Mabel was a woman who understood that power expressed itself most effectively through what you declined to do, and what she declined to do was invite Charlotte to the Women's Circle summer gathering, which met monthly and which controlled in the invisible but absolute way of such things who received work during harvest season and whose reputation remained intact through the slow months of winter. No explanation was given, none was needed. Frank Aldridge was less subtle. On Friday evening in front of the supply store where 4 or 5 men had gathered in the last of the daylight, he said what he thought in the voice he used when he wanted the whole street to hear. If Charlotte Wren is afraid of a little Kansas weather, maybe she ought to go back to Ohio instead of digging holes in decent people's land. The laughter that followed was not vicious. It was the laughter of people who found something absurd, which in some ways is harder to bear than hatred, because absurdity cannot be argued with. On Sunday, Reverend Morrow caught Charlotte after the service in the churchyard, his voice gentle and his eyes troubled with genuine concern. He was not a cruel man. He believed what he said. "Charlotte, I understand that the past year has been difficult, but I worry that fear is not a sound foundation for a life or a building." He paused. Preparation of this kind reflects a certain lack of trust in providence. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "Reverend, Noah did not build the ark because he was afraid. He built it because he was ready." She walked past him into the church. Morrow stood in the spring sunlight outside and thought about that for longer than he expected to. The groundbreaking happened the second week of May. Charlotte hired a work crew from Hayes 2 counties over, men who asked no questions and followed plans without commentary. The south hillside was composed of clay-rich soil over a limestone shelf, exactly the substrate her father's notebook described as ideal stable under load, naturally insulating impermeable to groundwater. They excavated 12 feet into the slope at a 15-degree angle, following the line Charlotte had staked herself over 3 days in April. What came next was the only technical explanation Charlotte ever gave, and she gave it not to the town, but to Nora Beale, her nearest neighbor, a widow of 35, who arrived one afternoon in June with a pot of corn porridge and an absence of questions that Charlotte found more valuable than any sympathy she had received since Gerald left. Nora set the pot down on the work table outside the excavation entrance and looked at the binder of drawings Charlotte had opened beside her. She did not ask what it was. She asked if Charlotte needed another pair of hands. Charlotte looked at her. "Can you dig?" Nora said she had dug her husband's grave alone in the winter of 1882. She could dig. Charlotte pointed her at a row of stakes and handed her a shovel. They worked in silence for an hour before Charlotte began to explain, not because she felt she owed an explanation, but because it was easier to describe what she was doing while she was doing it, the way you narrate a thing you have thought about alone for so long that speaking it aloud is its own kind of relief. The walls would be limestone block 18 inches thick, set in Portland cement, and lime plastered on the interior. No wood framing in the main structure because wood could rot in a sealed underground environment, and rot was a slow failure that would not announce itself until it was too late. The ceiling was a true Roman arch, the load distributed through the curve into the walls, and from the walls into the hillside itself, requiring no central support beam. 4 feet of compacted earth on top, dense enough to act as thermal mass, holding warmth in winter and cold in summer. The entrance door was the steel bank vault door from Dodge City, hung on custom iron hinges sealed with a deadbolt that operated only from inside. The ventilation pipe was 3-inch steel, angled to prevent rain and snow entry, painted limestone gray. The wood stove was cast iron vented through a separate pipe that emerged from the hillside disguised as a survey marker post. The water cistern was buried limestone mortar construction fed from the house well by a buried pipe insulated with packed straw. The shelves were oak. The floor was fieldstone over packed gravel. Nora listened without interrupting. When Charlotte finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one question. "Did your father ever build one of these?" Charlotte did not answer immediately. She looked at the notebook lying open on the work table, her father's handwriting covering the pages in the careful, compressed script of a man who had learned to record things precisely because precision was the difference between a mind that held and one that did not. "No," she said finally. "He knew how. He just didn't start soon enough." She did not explain what she meant. She picked up her shovel and went back to work. Nora did the same. The project took 4 months. By September, the structure was complete and invisible. The disturbed earth on the hillside already greening over with late-season grass, the steel door indistinguishable from the surrounding rock face unless you walked directly up to it and touched it with your hand. Charlotte stalked the interior over the course of October, carrying supplies down the hillside in the early morning hours before the town was awake. Canned goods, dried beans, rice salt pork, cornmeal coffee, medical supplies, extra blankets, 2 oil lamps and 20 gallons of lamp oil, a box of books, and her father's green notebook. It was the second week of October when Amy came. Her younger sister arrived on a Thursday afternoon driving her own wagon, James asleep in the back, wrapped in a quilt, Amy's face carrying the expression of someone who had been rehearsing a conversation during a long drive and was no longer sure it was the right one. They sat at Charlotte's kitchen table and drank coffee while James slept in the back room, and Amy looked at her sister the way she had been looking at her for a year, with a combination of worry and incomprehension that Charlotte had stopped trying to resolve. "What are you afraid of?" Amy said finally. Charlotte set down her cup. The kitchen was quiet around them, the October wind moving through the eaves, the last of the afternoon light slanting through the west window. She told Amy about their father. William Wren had died on the 14th of January, 1864, on the Illinois plains, caught in a storm that had come without adequate warning on a clear midday. He had been traveling with a survey partner, and the partner had not believed the signs William read in the sky, the quality of the light, the behavior of the horses, the particular stillness that preceded extreme weather on the open plains. William had hesitated. He had not wanted to be wrong. He had not wanted to cause difficulty. They had continued moving, and the storm had caught them 3 miles from any structure. Charlotte had been 14 years old. She had watched her mother receive the news and understood, in the way that 14-year-olds understand things that reshape everything that comes after, that her father had known. He had seen it coming. He had the knowledge and the time and everything he needed to act, and he had not acted because he had spent his whole life trusting that the worst would not actually happen to him. "I'm not afraid," Charlotte said. "I am ready." Amy was quiet for a long moment. Ready for what? For the moment when comfortable stops being enough. Amy left before dark. She drove away down the rutted track without looking back, and Charlotte stood on her porch and watched the wagon disappear into the brown autumn light. She did not know what Amy was thinking. She knew that what she had told her sister was the truest thing she had said to anyone in years, and she knew it had not been enough to make Amy understand, and she had stopped expecting it to be. 3 weeks later, Douglas Holt came to the building site. He arrived on a Wednesday morning with a surveyor. Charlotte did not recognize a young man with a transit level and a leather satchel. Holt was dressed well, as he always was, his boots clean, despite the mud, his expression carrying the professional warmth of a man who had learned to deliver bad news as though it were a form of assistance. He told her that Clause 7B of the original 1879 land purchase agreement, which concerned subsurface water rights in the southern quarter of her property, had come to his attention. There was a question about whether any construction affecting drainage patterns in that area required approval from the County Land Commission. He would need to file an inquiry. She should probably pause work in the meantime. Charlotte looked at the surveyor, then at Holt, then at the hillside behind her, where 4 months of her savings and most of her physical strength were embedded in the earth. "I will be at the Land Commission Thursday morning," she said. She went inside and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Her father had been a meticulous man. The cedar chest contained every document related to every piece of land the Wren family had ever owned or purchased, organized chronologically in brown paper folders tied with twine. Charlotte worked through the night by lamplight, reading contracts and survey records and property descriptions she had never had reason to examine before. At 3 in the morning, she found what she needed: a county survey record from 1871, 8 years before the purchase agreement Holt was citing, establishing the property boundaries of the south parcel with measurements that contradicted the subsurface water rights claim entirely. The 1879 agreement had incorporated the 1871 survey by reference. Holt's Clause 7B applied to a different parcel. She appeared before the Land Commission on Thursday morning without a lawyer, carrying the 1871 survey, the 1879 purchase agreement, in a handwritten notebook in which she had transcribed the relevant sections of Kansas property law from the county library over 3 weeks in August, when she had already suspected that Holt might find a reason to interfere. The commission reviewed her materials for 20 minutes. Holt sat at the opposite table and said very little. The commission ruled in her favor. Charlotte walked out of the courthouse into the October sunlight and drove home without stopping. She put the documents back in the cedar chest and went down to the hillside and resumed work. She did not feel victorious. She felt more than anything tired in the specific way of someone who has had to spend energy proving something that should not have required proof. Holt left the courthouse without speaking to her. She did not look back. November passed quietly. The stories about Charlotte's project had faded into the background noise of the town's concerns displaced by harvest accounting and winter preparation, and the ordinary absorptions of community life. Occasionally, she heard herself mentioned at the post office, or noticed a group of women go briefly quiet when she walked past the church steps, but the intensity of the summer's attention had softened into something more like mild, ongoing bemusement. She continued stocking the shelter. She made final adjustments to the ventilation system, checked the door seals, tested the water flow from the cistern. She built a small writing table into the corner near the entrance and placed her father's green notebook on it beside her own records. She had stopped thinking of the shelter as a project. It had become simply a place that existed like the house and the land available and ready. On the 10th of January, 1888, Charlotte walked out to the South Hillside at first light and stood looking northwest. The sky was the color her father had described in his notebook in December of 1863, a steel blue so deep it was nearly violet at the horizon, cloudless in a way that was not the absence of weather, but its gathering. The air was wrong, too dry, too still, carrying a stillness that was not peace. The horses in her small pasture were restless, moving in tight circles, pressing against the fence line. A flock of starlings that had been roosting in the cottonwood by the creek since October had vanished overnight. She went inside, made coffee, and read the signs again. Then she picked up her coat and her lamp and her father's green notebook and walked down to the shelter and went inside and pulled the steel door closed behind her and set the deadbolt. She spent the afternoon organizing the shelves one final time, checking seals, trimming lamp wicks. That evening, she wrote in her own journal, a habit she had maintained since Gerald left the private record of a woman who had stopped expecting to be heard, and so had learned to listen to herself instead. What she wrote that evening was this: Father knew how to read the sky. I learned from his notes. I have been waiting 2 years for this moment, and I am still not certain I am ready for it. But I am here. The door is closed. The lamp is lit. Whatever comes, I will not be caught in the open. The blizzard struck Millhaven at noon on the 12th of January, 1888. It arrived without the slow buildup that people remembered from ordinary winter storms. The morning had been cold, but still the kind of stillness that the townspeople interpreted as a pause rather than a preparation. Children walked to school. Owen Pruitt opened his store. Harriet Dunn had bread in the oven. Frank Aldridge was working the bellows in his smithy, the fire orange and hot in the gray morning light. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours. The storm that struck the Great Plains that day would later be called the School Children's Storm, a name earned from the terrible particular of its timing, arriving in the midday hours when children were walking home from schoolhouses across Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, catching them on open roads without shelter, without warning, without any way to understand what was descending on them from the north. Across the Great Plains, more than 230 people died. Many of them were children. Many of them dotted within sight of structures that might have saved them if they had known to look or had time to reach them. In Millhaven, the storm found people wherever they were. The schoolhouse held the children inside safe as long as the teacher kept the stove fed, but the teacher was nearly out of wood by the second day. Families trapped in houses found their coal and wood supplies running shorter than anyone had planned for a storm of this severity. Deputy Marsh rode his circuit on the first day and found 3 families without adequate heat, 2 elderly residents who could not leave their homes, and a situation developing at the boarding house where 15 people had taken shelter, but which had no insulation worth the name, in a chimney drawing poorly against the wind. The roads were impassable by the end of the first day. The temperature continued to fall. On the 5th day, with his radio equipment dead and no way to reach outside help, Marsh remembered something a farmer had mentioned at the end of summer. Charlotte Wren had built something into the South Hillside, something nobody had understood. He started walking. He gathered people as he went, those who could still move and those who could be helped to move, working his way south through snow that was waist-deep in the drifts and knee-deep in the flat places, the cold working at every exposed inch of skin, the wind cutting through wool and leather as though they were paper. 27 people, children carried in arms, an elderly man supported between 2 younger ones. The blacksmith, Frank Aldridge, larger than anyone else, breaking trail through the worst drifts, saying nothing. 2 miles, then 3, the hillside appearing out of the white dark like a rumor. And then the smoke, that thin, pale thread rising from a pipe that had no reason to be there. Marsh climbed the last 100 yards and raised his fist and knocked on a door that was nearly invisible in the hillside and waited with 27 people behind him, and the temperature still falling and the wind still cutting, and somewhere in the back of his mind below the urgency and the cold, a quiet, unwilling thought forming about a woman he and everyone he knew had spent 8 months treating as a source of amusement. The bolt slid back. The door opened. Charlotte Wren stood in the lamplight with a lantern in her hand and the accounting of her supplies already recalculating behind her eyes. And she looked at the people standing in the cold and snow and dark, and she said one word: inside. The first thing Charlotte did after sealing the door was count the wood. Not the people, not the food, not the water, the wood. Because wood was the only resource with an absolutely fixed limit, the one element of her calculations that could not be supplemented or substituted or rationed beyond a certain point. 2 cords stacked along the back wall, which she had cut and split herself in September from downed cottonwood along the creek bed. She counted the rows in the lamplight, while 27 people stood behind her, finding their footing in a space that had been designed for silence and was now filled with the sound of ragged breathing and quiet crying and the particular low moan of children too exhausted and cold to cry properly. 16 days at the rate required to keep this room at 55 degrees. Maybe 18 if she managed the damper carefully and the outside temperature rose above 0 for any sustained period. She opened her ledgers to a fresh page and began writing. "Listen to me," she said, not loudly, but in the voice she had used when she was teaching Sunday school 15 years ago, before Gerald, and before everything that came after the voice that assumed attention rather than requesting it. The room went quiet faster than she expected. "We have enough food for 18 to 20 days if we are disciplined. We have enough wood for 16 days if we maintain temperature at 55 degrees. That is not comfortable. It is survivable. Those are 2 different things, and from this moment forward, they are the only 2 things that matter." She looked around the room, meeting eyes where she could find them. "No one eats outside the schedule I set. No one opens that door without my knowledge. No one adjusts the stove without asking me first. These are not suggestions." Owen Pruitt raised his hand the way Frank Aldridge's youngest nephew did in school. "What about water?" Charlotte looked at him. She had already noted the water figure in her ledger, and she had not announced it, which was a decision she had made in the 30 seconds between sealing the door and beginning to speak. "We have enough," she said. "I will tell you more when I know more." It was the first time in her life she had said something she knew to be incomplete without flinching. Nora Beale appeared at her elbow without being summoned, the way she had appeared at the building site 6 months ago with a shovel and no questions. Charlotte handed her the lamp and pointed at the sleeping arrangement she had mapped out mentally while walking from the back of the shelter to the front. Families with children to the bunks along the east wall. Single adults to rotation sleeping on the floor in 3-hour shifts. Nora began moving people without ceremony, her voice low and matter-of-fact, and Charlotte watched her for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude, but was in the same neighborhood. Deputy Marsh stood near the stove, still in his frost-covered coat, his face beginning to return to its normal color. He had said almost nothing since Charlotte opened the door. He watched her work with the expression of a man reassessing something he had assumed he understood. By the time the first meal was distributed, the shelter had settled into something approaching order. Not comfort, order. The distinction mattered. The first night was the hardest, and not in the way Charlotte had anticipated. She had prepared for the physical difficulties. The smell of 28 people in a space built for one. The noise, the disruption of sleep by other people's movements and coughs, and the low involuntary sounds of people processing fear in the dark. What she had not fully anticipated was the weight of being the one person in the room who could not stop thinking. She sat near the stove through most of that first night, monitoring the thermometer she had mounted on the east wall, adjusting the damper in increments of a quarter turn, watching the temperature hold at 54-55 back to 54. Her ledger was open on her knee. The lamp was turned low to conserve oil. Around her, people slept in the imperfect, restless way of those who are too exhausted not to sleep and too frightened to sleep well. At 2 in the morning on the second night, Frank Aldridge stood up. Charlotte saw him the moment he moved. She had not been sleeping. She watched him make his way through the bodies on the floor toward the door, careful about where he put his feet until he was close enough to the steel door that his next step would take him to the handle. Mr. Aldridge, he stopped, did not turn around. If you open that door, the cold air will pull the heat out of this room in under 4 minutes. The stove cannot recover that loss with the wood we have left. The temperature will drop to a level that is dangerous for the children before morning. Frank turned then. His face in the low lamplight was not angry exactly. It was the face of a large man in a small space who has been still for too long and whose body was beginning to register the confinement as something close to panic. I need air, he said. I know. The ventilation pipe is drawing adequately. The air in here is not as clean as outside, but it is not harmful. Your body is telling you it cannot breathe because you feel enclosed. That feeling is accurate. It is not the same as actually suffocating. You cannot keep me here. That is correct, Charlotte said. You can leave at any time. The bolt operates from the inside and I will not stop you. She paused. The temperature outside is 40 below zero, and it has been falling for 6 hours. You would not survive until morning. And when the children in this room wake up and ask where you went, there will be nothing I can tell them that will not do damage I cannot repair. The shelter was very quiet. Marsh was awake. Charlotte could tell by his breathing, but he said nothing, and she was aware of the specific quality of his silence, the silence of someone who has recognized that intervention would be the wrong choice. Frank Aldridge stood at the door for a long time, long enough that Charlotte began calculating what she would do if he reached for the handle. Long enough that she understood she did not have a plan for that and only a hope that the arithmetic she had just stated plainly would do what arithmetic sometimes does in the face of fear, which is hold. He sat down. He did not look at her. He pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the floor and said nothing for the rest of the night. But he sat down. On the 5th day, James got sick. It was a fever, nothing dramatic in its presentation, a child sleeping too much and eating too little, his forehead warm under Amy's palm. Amy found Charlotte at the stove before breakfast, her voice already carrying the particular pitch of a mother's controlled terror. He was coughing in the night. He feels hot. Charlotte put the back of her hand to the boy's forehead, then to his throat, then listened with her ear against his small chest for 30 seconds. His breathing was unlabored. His color was off, but not alarmingly so. The shelter's air was damp and cold, and he had been breathing it for 5 days without the sun and movement his body was accustomed to. She went to the medical cabinet and took out dried ginger and dried chamomile and a small tin of willow bark she had packed in September without being certain she would ever need it. She prepared a tea in a tin cup, measured it out carefully, and handed it to Amy with instructions. Small sips once per hour. Keep him warm. Watch his breathing. Amy took the cup and held it in both hands and looked at Charlotte with an expression that was working through several things at once. You packed medicine for a child, she said. James was not born when you started building this. Charlotte looked at her sister. I packed medicine for whoever might need it. Amy was quiet for a moment. Then, I did not believe you. When you came to me in October and explained, I thought you were still angry about Gerald and it had turned into something else. Charlotte did not answer immediately. She watched James curl against his mother's side, his eyes closing, his small chest rising and falling evenly. He will be better in a day, she said. Keep him warm. James's fever broke in 18 hours. On the 8th day, one of the Pruitt grandchildren, a girl of about 7, began to cry and could not stop. Not the sharp crying of pain or fear, but the low, inconsolable weeping of a child who has run out of the ability to pretend that everything is ordinary. Several adults nearby tried to quiet her, hushing and patting, and offering the child the kind of comfort that adults give when they are themselves barely holding together, which is to say, not very effective comfort. Harriet Dunn stood up. It was unexpected enough that the movement drew attention in itself. Harriet, who had been nearly silent since the night she arrived, who had sat in her assigned corner and eaten her rations and slept her rotation shifts, without complaint and without the commentary that characterized everything she did, above ground, walked over to the child and sat down on the floor beside her without making a production of it. She began to tell a story. Charlotte heard it from across the room while she was reviewing the wood count for the 4th time that day. It was about a family moving west in 1849, crossing the Cimarron in a wagon with two wheels already cracked, and a river that kept rising. Harriet's voice had none of the social performance it carried in the boarding house. It was level and unhurried, building detail by detail, and the girl's crying slowed within 2 minutes and stopped within 5. By the time Harriet reached the part where the family crossed safely and made camp on the far bank, she had an audience of 4 children and 3 adults who were pretending to sleep. Charlotte set down her pencil. She had spent 8 months watching Harriet Dunn deploy language as social currency, as commerce, as a mechanism for knowing things about other people before other people knew them. She had never considered the possibility that the same skill applied differently could hold frightened people together in the dark. She made a note in her ledger not about supplies, but about the distribution of labor. She added Harriet's name next to an entry that read, "Evening Hour Children." On the 10th night, Charlotte examined the water cistern by lamplight while the shelter slept. She had been putting it off since the 7th day, which was the first time she had noticed the moisture on the outer cistern wall, where there should not have been moisture. She had told herself it might be condensation. She had reviewed the construction sequence in her memory and identified 3 possible explanations, 2 of which were benign. She had waited 3 more days to check because she already knew what she was going to find, and she wanted 3 more days of not knowing it officially. The crack was in the lower south face of the cistern, hairline in width running 6 inches along the mortar joint between 2 limestone courses. The compacted earth outside the shelter had shifted under repeated freeze-thaw cycling as the storm moved through its phases, and the movement had been enough a fraction of an inch to open a seam. She measured the moisture on the floor below the crack with 2 fingers and held them up in the lamplight. Not catastrophic, but real. She woke Marsh and Nora quietly, and the 3 of them sat at the small table near the entrance and did the arithmetic in low voices with Charlotte's ledger open between them. At current usage, the cistern loss moved their water supply from 17 days to 13, maybe 14. The storm showed no sign of breaking. The National Guard had not yet been mentioned in the story at this point, so this is kept consistent. Relief was days out at minimum. The gap was 3 days. Snow, Nora said. Charlotte had already arrived there. The snow outside the door was the purest water source available, unlimited in quantity, requiring only heat to convert. Opening the door each morning for a controlled 5-minute period using packed cloth containers to collect the maximum volume with minimum heat loss would address the deficit. The cost was wood. She calculated it at 20% of their remaining supply, which would lower the ambient temperature from 55 degrees to approximately 50. 50 degrees was cold. It would be felt in the hands and feet first, then in the joints of anyone over 50, of which there were 7 in the shelter. It would make sleeping harder and moving slower, and thinking at its worst a little less reliable than usual. It would not kill anyone. She told the entire shelter at breakfast. Not a suggestion, a statement of what was going to happen and why, the same way she announced ration schedules and work assignments. She watched faces as she spoke. Most of them showed the look she had come to recognize over the past 10 days, the look of people who have surrendered the burden of deciding things to someone who will decide them, which is not the same as trust, but is sometimes indistinguishable from it in practice. Douglas Holt spoke from the back of the room. "You are deciding for all of us." Charlotte looked at him. He was thinner than he had been 10 days ago. They all were, but he held himself the same way he always had, with the bearing of a man accustomed to the deference of rooms. "Yes," she said, "we have no say in this. Anyone who would like to offer an alternative proposal has 30 seconds. The stove is losing heat." The room was silent for 30 seconds. Holt said nothing further. Charlotte went back to her ledger. That evening after the dinner, ration had been distributed, and the evening prayer led by Reverend Morrow, in a voice that had shed over 10 days underground most of the pulpit authority it had carried above ground. Holt found Charlotte checking the wall temperature near the entrance. He came to stand beside her in the way of a man who has decided to say something he has been arguing himself out of for several days. "Charlotte," he waited until she looked at him. "When we get out of here, I will return the north parcel. The 40 acres. Full deed transfer, no conditions." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because you saved my life." She turned back to the thermometer. The mercury stood at 51. She made a note. "Mr. Holt, you took that land because you knew I could not afford to fight you for it. You used the law the way you have always used everything, as a tool for getting what you want, without having to admit that you want it. Now you are sitting in a shelter that I built, and you feel something that I imagine is uncomfortable, and you would like to do something that makes it feel less uncomfortable. She capped her pencil, and that is your concern, not mine. I did not open that door to make anyone owe me anything. She walked away. He remained standing by the wall thermometer for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. On the 12th night, Charlotte sat alone. Marsh was asleep for the first time in 3 days, his back against the east wall, his coat folded under his head. Nora was on air pump rotation, the slow, rhythmic sound of the manual bellows marking time in the dark. Everyone else was down. Charlotte opened her ledger to the supply page and looked at the numbers she had been updating twice daily since the first morning. Wood 6 days at current temperature. Water 4 days with the snow collection routine. Food 8 days. The arithmetic was still workable. The National Guard would be moving when the storm broke, and the storm would break because storms always broke. She knew this. She had planned for this. And yet, she sat with the ledger on her knee in the near dark and felt for the first time since she had closed the bolt behind the last of 27 people, the specific vertigo of a plan reaching the edge of its own certainty. The numbers were right. The construction was sound. The routines were holding. But there was a gap between the edge of what she had prepared for and the beginning of what she could not control, and that gap was measured in days, and some of those days were still ahead of her. She looked up at the ceiling. Limestone arched the mortar joints. She had pointed herself in the last week of August, the faint sheen of condensation that had been there since the 4th day, and which she had checked 3 times to confirm was not structural. The ceiling was fine. Everything she had built was fine. She looked across the room at James asleep on the lower bunk. One small hand hanging off the edge of the mattress she had sewn herself from ticking and dried corn husks. The boy was breathing easily. His color was good. He had eaten his full ration at both meals today and had fallen asleep holding a book Charlotte had read him from the shelf, a collection of frontier stories she had packed without thinking much about why. She opened her ledger to a new page and began writing contingency plans she hoped she would not need. If the guard was delayed an extra 2 days, reduce the heating period each evening by 90 minutes, supplement with body heat by consolidating sleeping arrangements. If the wood ran out before relief, the oak shelving along the west wall construction, grade lumber, not ideal flowing but workable. If the water collection became insufficient, reduce the morning ration by 1/4 and explain exactly why. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. Then she wrote a little more in the dark from memory, the number she already knew by heart. She did not allow herself to think about the other possibility, the one she had no plan for. She wrote it in the margin of the last page anyway, in handwriting small enough that only she could read it. If wrong, fix it. If too late to fix, hold until it is over. Then she closed the ledger and went to trim the lamp. The 14th night arrived with a stillness that was different from the stillness of the previous nights, though Charlotte could not have said immediately what the difference was. She registered it the way you register a change in the sound of a machine you have been listening to for 2 weeks, a subtle shift in the rhythm of a familiar thing. She was at the stove at 4 in the morning when she understood. The draw was wrong. She held her palm near the stove's air inlet for 10 seconds and felt what was not there. The slight, steady pull of air moving through the ventilation system toward the combustion chamber. It was absent. The stove was burning on the air already, in the room consuming it slowly, the combustion becoming incrementally less complete with each passing minute. She went to the ventilation pipe access and removed the inspection plate. The pipe was cold and the airflow gauge hung motionless. She put her fingertip to the gauge and it did not move. Snow blockage at the exterior cap. The storm had been weakening for 2 days and the wind had shifted, and the shift had pushed drifted snow over the pipe's exterior opening. It was a possibility she had noted in her construction plans and addressed with a rain cap design intended to prevent it. The cap had done its job for 14 days. Tonight it had not. She did not think about why. She crossed to Frank Aldridge and shook his shoulder. He was awake in 3 seconds, which told her he had not been sleeping deeply, and she was briefly grateful for that. She took him to the far corner and spoke in a voice below the level of the room's ambient noise. She explained what had happened and what needed to happen next. Frank looked at the access hatch she pointed to, cut into the upper rear wall of the shelter, at the point where the hillside was shallowest above the structure, 18 inches square, framed in oak. and sealed with a wooden cover and two hand-turned bolts. He looked at it for a moment. You built that in case of this. I built it in case of anything. Frank worked himself through the access hatch with the determined efficiency of a large man who has decided to do something regardless of whether his body is well suited to it. Charlotte and Marsh fed rope through after him, a 30-foot length she had coiled on a hook near the entrance since the first week. The temperature outside was somewhere around -20, and the exterior was still dark, the first gray light of dawn not yet visible. He was gone for 40 minutes. Charlotte stood at the access hatch and listened to the sounds from outside, which were mostly the wind and occasionally a scraping sound that told her he was working. Marsh stood beside her without speaking. The shelter behind them was still asleep, or pretending to be. When Frank came back through the hatch, the cold came with him like a third presence, filling the corner of the shelter instantly. His hands were the color of old wood and not moving correctly when he pulled himself through and sat against the wall. Charlotte was already opening the medical kit. She unwrapped his hands and examined them by lamplight, pressing each finger, watching the capillary return. Cold injury, not frostbite. She had packed 2 linen bandages soaked in beeswax and wrapped them around his hands and helped him hold them against his own chest for warmth. He looked at his hands while she worked. Then he said without looking up, I called you crazy in front of half the town. Said you were wasting your money on a hole in the ground. Charlotte wrapped the second bandage and tucked the end. I know. I said it more than once. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. I am sorry. Charlotte tied the last knot and sat back on her heels and looked at him. The lamp was between them and his face was fully lit. A large man sitting against a limestone wall with his bandaged hands held against his coat and his eyes carrying something she recognized as the specific fatigue of a person who has been holding a position they know is wrong and has finally set it down. I know that as well, she said. By morning, the stove was drawing normally. The shelter woke to its routine without knowing that anything had changed in the night. Charlotte added the wood used for recovery heat to her ledger and revised her calculations. They were tighter than she wanted, but they held. Marsh found her at the stove an hour after breakfast, standing with her coffee and looking at the thermometer. He had been watching her for 3 days with the expression of a man composing something he has not yet found the right words for. What you are doing here, he said. There is a word for it. I have been trying to find the right one. Charlotte looked at the thermometer. 53 degrees. She would need to feed the stove within the hour. There is not one word, she said. There are about 14. On the morning of the 15th day, Charlotte woke at first light to a quality of silence that stopped her before she was fully upright. She lay still and listened to it. It was not the silence of the shelter's interior, which she knew as well now as the inside of her own house, every creak and breath and settling sound. It was a silence that was coming through the walls, through the stone and earth and 4 feet of compacted soil above her head. A silence from outside that was different in its texture from the silence of a storm bearing everything in white. She stood up and walked to the entrance and put her ear against the steel door. The wind had stopped. She stood there for a brief moment with her palm flat against the cold metal. Then she reached for the bolt. She cracked the door 2 inches and felt the air, still brutally cold. But still, she opened it another 2 inches and looked through the cane at the sky above the hillside. The clouds were breaking. Not the heavy uniform gray ceiling that had pressed down for 15 days, but clouds with edges. Clouds with spaces between them, and in one of those spaces a strip of early morning sky, the color of pale iron shading toward blue. Charlotte stood at the 2-inch gap and breathed the outside air for the first time in 15 days and felt something move through her that she would not have been able to name if anyone had asked. It was not relief exactly. It was more like the specific sensation of a calculation coming out correctly after you have been running it wrong for days, the moment when the numbers finally resolve into something that makes sense. She opened the door fully. The light came in like a physical thing. 27 people who had been sleeping or sitting in lamplight for 15 days turned toward it involuntarily, the way plants turn without decision, simply following what their bodies recognize. The snow outside was immense. It had erased the landscape and replaced it with something simpler and more absolute drifts piled higher than fence posts. The path down the hillside completely gone. Millhaven itself invisible, 3 miles to the north under a white horizon. The cold was still dangerous, still well below zero, still capable of killing a person who stayed in it too long. But the storm was over. Charlotte turned back to the room. 27 faces looking at the light, some of them already crying, some of them silent, all of them carrying 15 days of underground living in the lines around their eyes and the particular thinness of people who have been rationed. She picked up her ledger. "Listen," she said. The room came to attention the way it had learned to over 15 days quickly and without argument. "The storm has broken. We are not done yet. The roads will be impassable for several more days, and the temperature is still dangerous for extended exposure. We stay on schedule. We stay on rations." She looked around the room. "We are alive. All of us. We will remain that way if we do exactly what we have been doing." She paused. "We are almost through the hardest part." Marsh stepped outside, raised his service revolver, and fired 3 shots into the pale morning sky. They waited. 3 miles away, across a white and silent plain, nothing moved. Charlotte noted the time in her ledger and wrote day 15. Storm broken, rescue unknown. Supplies would 4 days water, 3 days food, 7 days. All present, all alive. She closed the ledger and went to tend the stove. The silence that followed Marsh's 3 shots lasted long enough that people stopped waiting for an answer and went back to their routines. That was how Charlotte knew they had become something different from the group that had stumbled through her door 15 days ago. In the first week, every unexpected sound had produced a collective flinch. Every creak of the stovepipe, every shift of settling earth above the ceiling. Now they absorbed disappointment the way people absorbed weather, not with acceptance exactly, but with the practical resignation of those who have learned that their feelings about a situation do not change the situation. They went back to the wood rotation and the water log and the meal schedule because those things were the shape of survival, and they had learned to live inside that shape. Charlotte fed the stove and noted the wood remaining and did not tell anyone what she was thinking, which was that 4 days was the outer edge of what they had, and the National Guard moving through aftermath conditions on roads that had not been cleared in 15 days might need every one of those 4 days and possibly one more. She had a plan for that. She had written it in the margin of her ledger on the 12th night. She had not needed it yet. She was not going to need it if the arithmetic held through the next 72 hours. She was going to make the arithmetic hold. On the 16th morning, Mabel Forsythe found Charlotte outside. Charlotte had developed the habit of standing in the doorway for 10 minutes each morning, not fully outside, but at the threshold where she could read the light and the sky and the temperature without exposing herself to extended cold. It was a practice she had started the day the storm broke and continued for reasons she would have described as practical, which was only partly true. The other part was that after 15 days underground, she needed to see the horizon for 10 minutes each day, the way some people needed coffee, a restoration of some internal calibration that the enclosed space disrupted. Mabel came to stand beside her without being invited, which was unusual enough that Charlotte registered it immediately. They stood together for a moment looking at the transformed landscape. The drifts had settled overnight into slightly more defined shapes, the contours of the hillside beginning to reassert themselves beneath the snow. In the far distance, the smudge of smoke that marked Millhaven was thicker than it had been the day before, which Charlotte interpreted as a good sign. People rebuilding fires, people still there. Mabel spoke without turning her head. "I removed your name from the Women's Circle invitation list in June." Charlotte said nothing. "I told myself it was because your situation was unusual, that you were not quite in the same position as the other members." Mabel paused. "That was not the reason." "What was the reason?" Mabel was quiet for long enough that Charlotte thought she might not answer. "Then you made me uncomfortable. The way you lived, the way you moved through town without asking anyone's permission for anything, the way you looked at people when they said things you thought were foolish, like you were recording it somewhere and would remember it accurately forever." A short pause. "I used the authority I had to make your life harder because you made me feel a thing I did not like feeling." Charlotte looked at the horizon. The smoke from Millhaven rose straight in the still air. "What did I make you feel?" "Insufficient," Mabel said. She said it the way a person says a word they have been avoiding for months quickly, as though speed reduces the cost. "Like I had arranged my life around other people's opinions, and you had arranged yours around something else entirely, and yours was going to outlast mine." Charlotte was quiet for a long time. The cold was working at her face and hands, but she stayed at the threshold looking at the smoke. "I did not build this to make anyone feel insufficient," she said finally. I built it because I watched my father die in a storm he could see coming and chose not to prepare for. I spent 24 years thinking about that. I decided I would rather be wrong and ready than right and caught in the open. She glanced at Mabel. That is not a philosophy. That is just what I did with what I was given. Mabel nodded once. It was not a comfortable nod. It was the nod of a woman who had come out here with something to say and had said it and was now sitting with the consequences of having said it, which was always the hard part. I lost you the harvest work 2 seasons, Mabel said. I will not make that right because it cannot be made right. But I wanted you to know that I know. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back inside because the cold was becoming serious and held the door open. Mabel came in. The 17th day passed in a compression of waiting that was harder than the storm had been. Charlotte had observed this in the final stages of difficult things before that hope made time slower and more painful than despair did. Despair had a kind of terrible efficiency. Hope created an ache that grew with each hour that the thing hoped for failed to arrive. The children asked about home constantly. Adults who had not spoken much during the worst days were now talking too much, the words coming out as a release of pressure rather than actual communication. Owen Pruitt asked Charlotte 3 times during the course of the day whether she thought the roads might be passable sooner than she had estimated, and each time she gave him the same answer, which was that she did not know which was the truth, and each time he received it with a small nod that it suggested he had been hoping for a different truth. On the 17th evening, Reverend Morrow found Charlotte at the writing table in the corner, running numbers she had already run twice that day. He had lost the formal carriage he usually maintained, that particular alignment of spine and shoulder that belonged to the pulpit. He sat down across from her without the preliminary social gestures he normally used to open a conversation. I told you in October that preparation reflected a lack of faith, he said. Charlotte looked up. I remember. I have been thinking about that statement for 17 days. He looked at his hands on the table. They were thinner than they had been. All of their hands were thinner. I believe I had it exactly backward. What you did here required more faith than anything I have managed in 30 years of ministry. Not faith in the abstract. Faith that your own judgment was worth acting on, even when everyone around you was certain you were wrong. Charlotte set down her pencil. Reverend, you told me Noah built the ark because he trusted Providence. I told you Noah still had to do the building. I have been telling myself that conversation for 8 months. She paused. You helped me more than you know. Morrow looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was genuine surprise. He had come to offer something and instead found himself on the receiving end. He sat with that for a moment, adjusting. I did not intend to help, he said. I intended to caution. I know, it helped anyway. He smiled a small and unperformed smile, the kind that does not know it is happening until it has already happened. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, while the shelter settled around them, the sounds of people in the last hours before sleep. And then Morrow stood and went to lead the evening prayer in the voice that had changed so substantially in 17 days underground that several people had privately remarked it was the first time they had actually listened to him. On the 18th morning, before full light, Charlotte heard it. A sound from outside that did not belong to wind or settling snow or any of the ambient sounds she had cataloged and memorized in 15 days of listening. A rhythmic sound, mechanical and steady, coming from the north. She was at the door before she was fully awake, hand on the bolt. She opened it and stepped outside into the pre-dawn cold and turned north and listened. Bells, harness bells, the kind hung on draft horses pulling heavy loads in winter, designed to warn people on foot of approaching vehicles on roads where visibility was poor. And underneath the bells, the compressed creak of runners on packed snow, the sound of a heavy wooden sled moving at working speed. She stood in the doorway and listened to that sound grow for 2 full minutes before she went back inside. Get up, she said to the shelter. All of you, get your coats. She did not have to say it twice. They came out of the hillside into a morning that was still and brilliant, the overnight cold having compressed the air to a clarity that made distances deceptive, the horizon seeming both closer and farther than it actually was. The sun was not yet fully risen, but its light was already traveling horizontally across the snow, cutting long blue shadows from every drift and rise, turning the white plain into something almost beautiful. The sleds were coming from the north. Three of them heavy cargo vehicles pulled by teams of 4 draft horses, each their breath rising in synchronized clouds. Behind the sleds on horseback rode a column of men in blue coats with the yellow piping of the Kansas Volunteer Militia. At the front of the column on a gray horse that moved through the snow with the careful confidence of an animal that had done this before, was a broad-shouldered man whose rank insignia Charlotte could not read at distance, but whose bearing was unmistakably that of someone in charge. Captain Edwin Spears had been riding since 4 in the morning, having pushed his column out of haze before dawn, in the calculated gamble that roads cleared to the edge of passable the previous afternoon would hold through the overnight freeze. He had a list of settlements in Millhaven County and a casualty estimate from the county seat that he had been revising in his head since the briefing 2 days ago. The estimate for Millhaven itself was grim, a town of 300 with no dedicated storm shelter and no military installation within range. He had prepared himself in the professional way that soldiers prepare themselves for things they cannot change for what he expected to find. He had not prepared himself for 28 people walking out of a hillside. He brought his horse to a stop at the base of the hill and looked up at them. A woman was standing at the front of the group, not young, not large, wearing a coat that had seen better seasons, holding a ledger book against her chest. Behind her, 27 people in various states of cold weather, where thin but upright, their faces carrying the particular expression of those who have survived something they were not certain they would survive. Spears looked at Marsh, whom he recognized from the militia rolls. "Deputy? Captain," Marsh gestured at the hillside behind him. "She built that. Shelter for one, stocked for 4 months. We have been inside 18 days. Spears looked at the hillside, then at Charlotte. "You sheltered 28 people in there." 27, Charlotte said. "I was already inside." He looked at her for a moment. Then he dismounted and walked up the slope and stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked in. The lamp was still burning. The stove was still warm. The shelves were nearly empty, but the structure was intact, the floor clean, the bunks folded back, the ledger entries on the writing table filled from top to bottom in small, precise handwriting. He came back out and stood in front of Charlotte. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been doing this work for 19 years. I have seen a great deal of what people do and do not do when conditions turn severe." He paused. "I have never seen anything like this." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "How many in the county?" Spears understood the question. He had been carrying the number since the briefing. 11 dead in Millhaven County. Across the Great Plains, the estimate is above 230. Final count will be higher. Charlotte received that number in silence. 11 people she probably knew. 230 she did not know, but whose absence would be felt for years in the communities that had held them. She thought about her father in the snow on the Illinois plains in January of 1864, and then she stopped thinking about it because the thinking did not help, and there were 27 people behind her who needed to board those sleds. "Let us get the children loaded first," she said. The evacuation took the better part of 3 hours. The children went first bundled in militia blankets, lifted onto the cargo sleds where the militiamen had cleared spaces among the supply crates. Then the elderly, then the rest in groups organized by Marsh, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 18 days learning how Charlotte organized things and had absorbed more of it than he realized. Frank Aldridge was one of the last aboard. He stopped in front of Charlotte on his way to the sled, his bandaged hands held slightly away from his body. He was a large man, and the sled was some distance below them on the slope, and he stood with his back to it, looking at her with his hat in his hands, the way men of his generation held their hats when they were saying something they meant. "I'm going to stand up at the next town meeting," he said, "and I am going to say in front of everyone exactly what I said about you and exactly what I know now. Not to make myself feel better, because people should know." Charlotte looked at him. "You do not owe me a public accounting, Mr. Aldridge." "No," he said, "but Millhaven does." He put his hat back on and walked down the slope to the sled. Amy was the last one before Charlotte herself. She had been waiting, Charlotte realized. Standing slightly apart from the evacuation activity, holding James on her hip, even though he was old enough to stand watching her sister coordinate and direct and manage the final logistics of 18 days with the same methodical attention she had given to every hour of those days. Waiting until there was no one left between them, she came down the slope and stopped 2 feet from Charlotte and looked at her. James reached out and put a small hand on Charlotte's face the way very young children touch things they want to understand with the full palm, no hesitation. Charlotte held still and let him. "I am sorry," Amy said, "for not believing you, for thinking it was grief or anger turned into something strange." Charlotte looked at her sister. Amy had her father's eyes, the same pale gray that Charlotte saw in her own mirror, and right now they were wet and serious and carrying 24 years of a family's history in them. "You were not wrong to think it was unlikely," Charlotte said. "It was unlikely." "That is not the same as impossible," Amy said. "You told me that in October, and I drove away thinking you were quoting something." Her voice was unsteady. "You were describing yourself." Charlotte put her free hand on her sister's arm. The contact was brief and firm, the language of women who do not perform emotion but feel it completely. "You are here," she said. "James is here. That is the only accounting that matters to me." Amy shifted James on her hip and stepped forward and put her free arm around Charlotte, and Charlotte held her sister and her nephew in the cold morning air on the hillside above the shelter she had built, because a man she loved had died in a storm he had seen coming. And she thought about her father in the notebook and the years of preparation in the 18 days underground and the 27 people on the sleds below and all the converging lines of it, everything that had led to this particular morning and this particular embrace. She held on for as long as Amy needed. Then she stepped back and looked at her sister and said, "Get on the sled." Amy smiled through the cold and the wet on her face and went. Douglas Holt was already seated on the middle cargo sled when Charlotte came down the slope last of all. He saw her coming and watched her without the social performance of a man calculating his next move, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. When she reached the level ground, he stood up from the sled, which required some effort given its height, and stepped down onto the snow. "Miss Wren," he said. She stopped. They stood facing each other on the cold plain with the militia horses breathing steam around them and Millhaven somewhere to the north under its column of smoke. "I meant what I said," Holt told her. "The north parcel. Full deed transfer. I have already decided." Charlotte looked at him. "I know you meant it. I want you to know that I understand the difference between a debt and an apology. I am not asking you to accept one as the other." She considered him for a moment. Douglas Holt at 52, thinner than his clothes expected, standing in the snow, without his usual armor of authority, in financial position, saying something true in plain language. She had spent a year and a half being angry at this man, not the hot kind of anger, but the cold, sustained kind that lives in the back of the mind and colors everything it touches. She was surprised to find standing here that the color had changed. "Return the land," she said. "That is the right thing because it was the wrong thing to take. The two of us are not required to be anything to each other beyond that." She paused. "But I will tell you something, Mr. Holt. The day I beat you in front of the Land Commission with my father's survey record in a notebook I copied by hand from the county law library, that was the day I understood that I was going to be all right regardless of what you or anyone else did." She looked at him steadily. "You did not make me strong. You just found out I already was." Holt stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a verdict he knows is accurate. He climbed back onto the sled. Charlotte boarded the lead sled and did not look back at the hillside as the horses started moving. She had said goodbye to that place in the 4 minutes she had spent inside it alone, after everyone else was out, standing in the empty room with the lamp turned down and her hand on the cold wall, feeling the construction she knew by memory in every joint and joint. She would be back. She had work to do there. But that goodbye was private between her and what she had built, and she had said it completely. The ride to Millhaven took 40 minutes. The town appeared gradually out of the white distance, first the church steeple, then the roof lines, then the individual structures, becoming distinct as the sleds moved up the main road that the militia had cleared to a single passable lane. People came out of buildings as the sleds arrived, standing on cleared stoops and porches, watching the cargo sleds come in. The word moved through Millhaven in the particular way that news moved through small places, person to person, doorway to doorway, with a specific velocity of information that changes the shape of what people thought they knew. 28 people, Charlotte Wren's shelter, 18 days. By the time the sleds stopped in front of the boarding house, half the town was outside. 3 months later, in April of 1888, the Millhaven Community Hall was full, in a way it had not been since the Harvest Festival of 1885. Captain Spears was there in his militia coat with the campaign ribbon he had been issued 2 weeks prior for his conduct during the storm response. A representative from the Kansas State Board of Agriculture sat at the front table with a leather folio of documents. The county newspaper had sent a correspondent from Hayes. Charlotte sat in the third row in her good coat, which she had repaired over the winter, with new buttons and relined with fresh flannel, and waited for the part of the evening she was dreading. Spears presented the final casualty figures first. 11 dead in Millhaven County, 238 confirmed dead across the Great Plains, a number the correspondent from Hayes wrote down with the careful hand of someone recording something that would still be written about 50 years from now. Then Spears presented the findings on Charlotte's shelter, which the militia engineers had surveyed and documented in February as part of the county after-action review. He used words like thermal efficiency and structural integrity and community resilience, the language of official reports, and then he set down his papers and spoke without them. The woman who built that shelter, he said, built it alone at her own expense over 4 months while her community told her she was wasting her time. She stocked it, maintained it, and when 27 people arrived at her door in the worst storm in 40 years, she let them in and kept them alive for 18 days with planning and discipline and a set of routines she had worked out before any of them arrived. He paused. I have read the after-action notes. I know what those 18 days contained. I want this community to understand that what Charlotte Wren did in that shelter was not luck. It was not instinct. It was the result of sustained, serious preparation that she undertook because she believed it was the responsible thing to do at a time when no one around her agreed with her. He looked at Charlotte in the third row. Ma'am, the board would like to hear from you. Charlotte had prepared 3 sentences. She stood up and delivered them to a room that was completely quiet. I did not build it to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I had learned at considerable personal cost that the world does not adjust itself to accommodate the unprepared. I would rather have built something I never needed than have needed something I never built. She sat down. There was a moment of silence that lasted long enough to be felt. Then Frank Aldridge stood up from his seat on the left side of the room. He was dressed in his good clothes, the ones he wore to church and to the county fair, and he held his hat in his hands the same way he had held it on the hillside the morning of the evacuation. He spoke without being recognized by the chair, which was not the usual procedure, and nobody moved to stop him. My name is Frank Aldridge, he said. I am in the blacksmith on Garrison Street. Most of you know me. Most of you have heard me say at various times over the past year that Charlotte Wren was building a foolish thing for foolish reasons, and that a sensible woman would stop digging holes in a hill and attend to her actual affairs. He paused. I want every person in this room to know that I said those things, loud and more than once. And I want every person in this room to know that I slept warm in that hole in the hill for 18 nights while the wind outside was cold enough to crack iron because Charlotte Wren built something that worked when everything else failed, and she let me in when she had every reason to leave me in the snow. He sat down. The applause began somewhere in the middle of the room and moved outward. Not the polite rhythmic clapping of an official occasion. Something more uneven and genuine, the sound of people releasing something they had been holding approval and recognition, and the particular relief of a community that has been wrong about something important and knows it and is saying so the only way it can. Charlotte sat in the third row and looked at the floor and thought about her father. She thought about this green notebook in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, the careful handwriting, the diagrams of soil composition and structural load, the knowledge that had been waiting in a trunk for 24 years to become something more than a dead man's record of things he had understood too late to use. She thought about the January morning in 1864 when William Wren had read the sky correctly and paused when he should have moved, and the January morning in 1888 when his daughter had read the same sky and done the thing he had not done. She had not saved 27 lives. She had made a decision and then another decision and then 100 more decisions, each one following from the last, each one made with the best information she had at the time and the willingness to be wrong and correct and wrong again until the sum of the decisions added up to something that held. That was all it was. That was everything it was. After the meeting, people found her in the small ways that Millhaven people had for acknowledging things they did not have larger language for. Owen Pruitt told her he had ordered 3 additional shipments of Portland cement and was thinking about what else he should be stocking. Harriet Dunn pressed her hand and said nothing, which was in some ways the most remarkable thing Harriet had done in Charlotte's memory. Mabel Forsythe walked past her on the way out and said without stopping that the women's circle met the second Thursday of the month and that Charlotte's name was on the list, and then continued walking before Charlotte could respond. Charlotte walked home in the April evening. The sky overhead, the pale clear blue of early spring, the snow retreated to the shaded places. The first suggestion of green coming up along the south-facing banks where the sun hit first. The plains ran out around her in every direction, flat and open and enormous, the way they had been running out around Millhaven since before anyone in it was born. Nora Beale was waiting on Charlotte's porch. She had a pot of something warm and a wool coat over her arm, and the expression of a person who has decided to wait however long it takes. Charlotte came up the path and Nora stood, and they looked at each other in the early evening light. "I heard what Frank said," Nora said. "The whole town heard." "I heard what you said, too." Nora handed her the pot. 3 sentences. 3 was enough. Nora smiled. "I was thinking," she said, "about the second shelter." Charlotte took the pot and looked at her. "You remembered that. You said 50 people, larger than the first, and that you wanted to teach the design to anyone who wanted to learn." "I did say that. I also said I knew how to dig." Charlotte looked at Nora Beale, this woman who had appeared at a building site with a shovel and no questions in the summer of 1887, and had been a steady and uncomplicated presence through everything that followed. There was not a category in Charlotte's experience for what Nora was to her. Not quite neighbor, not quite friend, something that had not needed a name yet because it had been expressed entirely in parallel labor and shared silence. "Come inside," Charlotte said. "I will make tea and we can look at the drawings." They sat at the kitchen table while the April evening settled into dark outside the lamp between them, the drawings spread out across the wood. The second shelter was more ambitious than the first, the entrance positioned differently to account for what Charlotte had learned about snow accumulation patterns from the winter just past the water system, redesigned to eliminate the vulnerability that the cistern crack had exposed. 3 families in Millhaven had already asked about building their own. The county board had sent a letter requesting that Charlotte submit her design specifications for potential inclusion in a rural community preparedness circular they were developing. She would submit the specifications. She would help the 3 families. She would build the second shelter because the first one had held, and she understood its limitations now and could build the next one better. She was not done. Charlotte poured the tea and pushed a cup across to Nora and bent over the drawings, and outside the window the Kansas plains ran away in every direction into the dark, waiting the way they had always been waiting for whatever came next. The shelter on the south hillside sat empty now. Its stove cold, its shelves bare, but the door was not locked. Charlotte had stopped locking it after the evacuation, a decision she had made without deliberating over it. If someone needed it, the bolt was on the inside. That had always been the point. Safety was not something you hoped for. It was not something that happened to you if the weather was kind and the people around you were careful and the years fell in a favorable order. It was something you built one decision at a time, the months and years before you needed it, when everyone around you was certain that the worst would not come and that the person preparing for it was wasting something valuable on something unnecessary. Charlotte Wren had been called paranoid and excessive and strange. She had been excluded and mocked and legally maneuvered against and told by her church, her community, and her own sister that she was operating from fear rather than faith. She had built anyway, not because she knew the storm was coming, not because she was certain and everyone else was wrong, but because she understood in the way that some people understand things that cannot be fully explained to those who have not yet needed to know them, that the difference between surviving and not surviving was almost never luck. It was almost always something someone had done or not done months or years before the moment that mattered. Her father had known that too. He had written it down in a green notebook that sat in a cedar chest for 24 years, waiting for someone to read it as instructions rather than history. Charlotte had read it as instructions. She picked up her cup and looked out the dark window at the prairie she had lived beside for 48 years, and she thought about the second shelter and the third one after that, and all the people in all the towns across the Kansas plains who had come through the winter of 1888, not understanding yet that the question was not whether another storm was coming. The question was, what would be standing when it arrived? She already knew her answer. She had always known her answer. She went back to the drawings and began to mark the changes for the next build, her pencil moving in the careful, compressed script her father had taught her before she learned to read anything else. The handwriting of people who record things precisely because precision is the distance between what holds and what does not. Outside, the April night was quiet and cold and full of stars.